if you wanted to summarise the Republican plot, you can say, well, there's men and women there who are active in the Rising, the War of Independence and the Civil War. This area here, these men and women would have remained anti-treaty during the Civil War. A lot of the pro-treaty are literally just beside them on the other side of that footpath. So a lot of men and women buried in that section would have fought for the pro-treaty side. Nevertheless, over 77 big names within that plot. You can ask myself at the end, or upstairs in the exhibition, highlight some of the bigger names who are buried here. There's Grace's sister. You can see the headstone, Muriel Gifford MacDonagh. So there's an image of Grace's sister, Muriel, and there's Tomas MacDonagh just beside her. So the Gifford sisters are buried not too far away from each other. Beside her, the likes of Brewer, we'll mention him as well. But just beside me, this is one of the most important graves in Irish history. The 1916 Rising, if you wish, all began here at Glasnevin at the funeral of the old Fenian Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. O'Donovan Rossa was born in 1831, 1 year before this place even existed. He was born in County Cork, and his family were decimated by the famine. I mean, like 12 members of his family simply could not survive the famine. He was lucky enough to survive it, but it left him with a fiery passion for Irish independence and a bitter hatred towards the British government. So he forms an organisation, the Phoenix National Literary Society. Now, you could say they sound quite harmless. Like a woman said to me earlier on, are they a book club? Is that what he formed? They do sound a bit like a book club, to be fair. No, they're a very violent revolutionary group, so they're far from a book club, but their objective is to win Ireland independence. James Stephens, John O'Leary and John Devoy, these three men help organise this group, the Fenians, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood, just better known as the Fenians. For O'Donovan Rossa, he joins the Fenian movement, and these four men, amongst others, try to win Ireland independence. Because of his Fenian activities, himself and John Devoy spent most of their time in and out of British prisons until the 1860s. Now, the British government gave them an option: rot and die in prison. The British authorities said, no problem, you can rot away in prison until you die, or you can go to America, it's up to yourselves. So both men said, brilliant, yeah, exile us to New York and America. And the British authority did. Probably one of the biggest mistakes they ever made was exiling two Irish men to New York, because the minute they arrived there, the Irish people living there welcomed these men. These are patriots, these are heroes, these are old rebels. These men, John Devoy and O'Donovan Rossa, are responsible for your gun running from Germany and your funding for the 1916 Rising. So naturally, when he died in 1915 in New York, his body was sent home immediately. And Thomas Clark, an old rebel himself and leader of the 1916 Rising, organises this man's funeral. There was hundreds of people at it. So there's a photograph taken. That's the 1st of August. That's 1915. You're roughly standing around this section. And if you were standing here over 100 years ago, big names of the Rising are standing literally just beside you. So Thomas Clark said, look, if you bury the old Fenian and give him the respect he deserves, but imagine the propaganda value attached to it, you'll gather a huge amount of men and women here, and we can inspire them to fight in the Rising. So that's one of the reasons why Clark organises this. So if you zoom in on this photograph, you can see a few famous faces who were here that day. So there's the likes of Joseph Plunkett. So Plunkett is standing just there. Beside Joseph Plunkett, you've Major John McBride. So McBride and Plunkett. You also have the likes of Thomas Clark. So there's your old rebel and your organiser of the funeral. Brewer. As we know, Cahill is buried just over there. We'll mention him shortly. And you have the likes of this man here. Now, many people don't realise who this is. He stood there as a school teacher and a poet in a green uniform in 1915, and that's Patrick Pearse. So Patrick Pearse was relatively unknown when he stood at the graveside, and Clark said to Pearse, "Going to write a speech, deliver the oration, make it fiery, throw caution to the wind, and inspire people." So from that exact spot, Pearse delivered one of the most famous speeches in Irish history. There's the last couple of lines of that speech. Finally, 3 consequences follow. Men and women left the cemetery following the funeral of O'Donovan Rossa and the words of Patrick Pearse and fought in the Rising. So many men and women were recruited here that day. The second consequence, well, there's Pearse standing here. Within 9 months and 2 days, he's now lying dead in the Stonebreakers Yard of Kilmainham jail. So Pearse went from unknown to very much well known just within the space of 9 months. And of course, 13 other men will be executed following that funeral just 9 months later. If you're the British authorities, you were standing around here, and the British authorities said, well, the Defence of the Realm Act, which spanned a lot of things during World War I throughout Britain and Ireland, the only thing it doesn't really ban is a funeral. So that's the loophole the Irish volunteers spotted, Patrick Pearse and Thomas Clark. So the British authorities stood here and said, well, we'll make notes. and never again will you see 14 repeats of that funeral. So hence why none of the leaders of the rising who were executed in Commandham jail are buried in Glasnevin. From a British perspective, one rebel's funeral inspired a rebellion. Multiply that graveside by 14, you'll have certainly another rebellion. The 14 men are buried in Arbour Hill Cemetery in Smithfield in Dublin, not too far away from here, and now you know why. So there's one of the most important gravesides within our history. Before I move on, we'll mention Cahill briefly, and of course Countess Markovic. So Cahill Brewer, who's just there, he fought in the Rising, South Dublin Union, where St James's Hospital is, on the other side of the city. That man was shot and wounded at least 22 times during the Rising, but he survived it. So there's Cahill Brewer. Note, that's not his real name. Now, he wasn't a big fan of his real name. He said it was too British. Charles William St John Burgess, that was his real name. Oh, he despised it, he really did. So Sinead De Valera's wife, translates his name to Cahill Brewer. There he is in his volunteer uniform. Now, members of the Royal Irish Regiment who fought up at St James's Hospital area found him in a room singing God Save Ireland in a pool of his own blood, with a gun in one hand and a box of bullets in the other. Now, there was a lot of hand-to-hand combat throughout the Easter week up at that part of Dublin. They took pity on Cahill. They said, what's even the point of arresting him? There's no way he'll survive this conflict. That man walked around Dublin within a year and a half, despite being shot and wounded at least 22 times. Became a very well-respected veteran. Come 1919, your Chief of Staff of the IRA is Cahill Brewer, and your Chief of Intelligence is Michael Collins. He survived the War of Independence up to 1921, and he was wounded twice during that conflict. But sadly, come 1922, during the Irish Civil War, if you walk down O'Connell or Parnell Street, you're going to see Cahill Brewer Street, where one bullet killed him. So he was anti-treaty, Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA, and a ricochet bullet struck him above his left knee and proved fatal and killed him. And that's where he's laid to rest today, just beside the old Fenian, John the Boy. So that's Cahill Brewer. Like I said, the street is named after him in Dublin. Out of all 77 people buried here, there's a very simple headstone just behind me, and her headstone is there, and she's buried right there today, and that's Countess Markovic. So the Countess is buried literally there. Feel free to have a look later on or come back down, it's really up to yourselves. So we'll talk about herself and then visit Collins. Born in London, Constance Georgina Gorbut. From an Anglo-Irish background, just like Maud Gonne. Spends a lot of her time in Sligo, so Lissadell House. So Markovic had three very fiery passions: Irish independence, she loved the labour movement, and the suffragette movement. So she wanted to campaign for workers' rights, women's rights, and fight for Irish independence. Now, she married a Polish count in 1901, so that's why she's known as Countess Markovic today. Three organisations of hers are active in the Rising. So you have to remember, she helps to form the Irish Citizen Army. So that uniform she has in the top photograph is the Irish Citizen Army she co-founded with James Connolly. Her second organisation is Cumann na mBan, the League of Women, or the Women's Council. So Maud Gonne, with her organisation, the Daughters of Ireland, joined forces with Countess Markovic's, and Markovic is your overall commander. And she has her Cumann na mBan uniform here. And she said to women, if you want to fight in the Rising, you sell your jewellery and you buy yourself a revolver. And that's how you become a member. And there's Markovic holding her own revolver there. So she helps organise that group. And finally, Nafina. To describe Nafina Airmen, Boy Scouts with weapons. That's exactly what they were. Because Markovic said, look, recruit them from the age of 12, give them a uniform, give them a weapon, and train them to fight in the Rising. So those three groups are helped to be organised by herself and all active in the Rising. She fought at St Stephen's Green, Royal College of Surgeons. So herself, she occupied the building alongside Michael Mallon. Irish Citizen Army were there. And the Shelbourne Hotel is occupied by the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. That sparks a 5.5-day gun battle. And within that conflict, she survived it. But she was quite active during the fighting. When Patrick Pearse stood here, 9 months later, he'd surrendered unconditionally. Markovic was fuming. I mean, she didn't want to surrender. She was desperate to fight on. But she followed Commandant Pearse's order. When she was arrested, the British authority delivered, the strictest order. Not a hair on her head is to be harmed. She's not to be executed. She's to be imprisoned for the rest of her life. Now, members of the Sherwood Forester Regiment were badly ambushed by Eamon de Valera. Some of them went on to execute the leaders of the Rising, but they also witnessed her behaviour, saying that she demanded execution, broke down in tears, and asked the British authority why don't they have the decency just to shoot her. So Countess Markovic demanded her execution, and that made her a household name in Irish history. She spent a year in prison, and she said that year she could do it standing on her head, no problem. So Countess Markovic, quite a courageous and brave woman, who was very active during the Rising. But the latter half of her life, look at her in 1918, the first woman in history to be elected to the British House of Commons. So imagine going from 1916 leader to a member of Parliament in Westminster. Markovic had every right to take her seat, but she refused to do so. But she inspired women throughout Ireland and Britain to become active. So there you go, the first woman ever elected to the British House of Commons. By 1919, she became a member of Dáil Éireann. She was a Minister for Labour in Dáil Éireann. A lot of these men and women who were elected to Westminster in 1918 wouldn't go. Eamon de Valera said, well, ignore the British Empire, form your own government. Sure, Brewer was involved, Countess Markovic was Minister for Labour, Michael Collins was Minister for Finance. He also said he was Minister for Gun Running, Daylight Robbery and General Mayhem at the same time. So a lot of these men and women became active within Dáil Éireann, and Countess Markovic, your Minister for Labour in 1919. But finally, she survived 3 conflicts throughout her life: the Rising, the War of Independence too. She was very much anti-treaty during the Civil War, survived that conflict, but died of ill health come 1926. So 1927 I should say. So by 1927 she was buried there, only 59 years of age now when she passed away. And when she was buried there, Cumann na Mán were here giving her a guard of honour, the members of the Irish Citizen Army, burying that lady like a soldier with full military honours. So one of few women in Irish history to receive those military honours. You can imagine a volley of shots fired above her grave as well. So for those reasons and many others, Countess Markovic is probably arguably the biggest name we have here within the Republican plot. But there's over like 77 names there, equally very impressive stories. So there's a couple of highlighted: Markovic, O'Donovan Rossa, Muriel Gifford, John Devine, Cathal Brewer, Stevens, O'Leary. We could go on for hours here. So feel free to walk around the Republican plot if you have the time. That's absolutely fine.